Carl Jung's most haunting insight into the human condition didn't revolve around empathy itself, but rather the backlash empaths receive from those they've compassionately supported. This phenomenon puzzled Jung deeply, prompting him to ask, why do people respond with hostility towards someone who only tried to help them? What he uncovered was more than an emotional contradiction. It was a map into the unconscious mind and its hidden shadows. Jung observed that empaths, those naturally attuned to the feelings and emotional undercurrents of others, were often blindsided by unexpected resentment. Despite offering emotional support, comfort, or practical help, they found themselves gradually pushed away, criticized, or even vilified. This wasn't random, nor was it about the quality of the help given. Instead, Jung concluded that empathy itself could trigger deep psychological discomfort, activating what he described as the shadow confrontation. In Jungian psychology, the shadow represents the unconscious aspects of ourselves. Our fears, weaknesses, emotional wounds, and traits we reject or suppress. When an empath offers help, their very presence can serve as a mirror reflecting back to the other person truths they are unwilling to face. The empath doesn't have to say anything judgmental. Simply being kind and perceptive is enough to stir up discomfort. Help becomes a spotlight that shines on the recipient's dependency, emotional needs, or lack of control, and this reflection is often intolerable. To the person receiving help, the experience may feel invasive, even if the intention was purely caring. Instead of gratitude, they feel exposed. Instead of supported, they feel judged, though no judgment was actually made. Their shame, pride, or unresolved psychological wounds twist the empath's assistance into an emotional threat. Jung described this as the helper's paradox syndrome, a predictable chain of events where acts of care rather than building trust provoke rejection. In one notable clinical case, a patient had been emotionally rescued by a close friend during a devastating life crisis. This friend provided steady support, loyalty, and comfort. Yet once the crisis faded, the patient began to complain the friend was too present, too involved, making me feel incapable. Eventually, the patient pulled away and severed ties, not because the friend failed them, but because the friend had reflected back something they couldn't bear to see their own vulnerability. Jung saw this not as an isolated case, but as a universal pattern in human relationships. Empaths, through no fault of their own, often awaken others to parts of themselves that are unhealed or denied. Rather than integrate that awareness, many reject the empath, the mirror, hoping that by discarding the reflection, they can escape the pain. But the pain isn't in the mirror, it's inside them. Jung's understanding of why empaths often feel attacked after helping others grew deeper as he studied the psychological mechanisms behind this paradox. Central to his theory was the idea of mirroring, a process in which the empath's presence unintentionally reflects back to others parts of themselves they have not yet come to terms with. This mirroring, though silent and unintended, can trigger intense psychological discomfort, which then converts into outward hostility. Jung called this chain of psychological reactions the shadow mirror effect. It unfolds in 3 distinct stages. The first stage is unconscious reflection. When an empath offers help, especially emotionally attuned help, they're not just offering a kind gesture. Their sensitivity allows them to instinctively align with the emotional frequency of the person in distress. Even without trying, empaths often see through people's facades and connect directly to their unspoken pain or need. This naturally bypasses the recipient's defenses and touches their deeper emotional truths. Jung emphasized that this kind of involuntary mirroring is not analytical or critical. It's simply a byproduct of the empath's attunement. But this connection creates a profound sense of exposure. The person receiving the help may feel as though the empath has seen them too clearly. And in that clarity, their hidden shame, insecurities, or dependency issues are now visible. Even though the empath has no intention of judgment, the experience feels invasive. The second stage is shadow activation. Here the psychological discomfort intensifies, as the empath reflects back the recipient's internal struggles. The latter's shadow is stirred. The shadow holds aspects of ourselves that we've repressed, like weakness, fear, neediness, or the desire to be cared for. Jung found that when these aspects are reflected back, the recipient often doesn't integrate them or acknowledge them. Instead, they react defensively. Rather than saying, "I feel exposed," or "this makes me uncomfortable," their psyche seeks an external source to blame for the internal distress. That blame lands on the empath. This leads to the third stage projection defense. Jung observed that recipients of empathic help often begin to project negative traits onto the empath as a way to justify their discomfort. They might accuse the empath of being condescending, manipulative, controlling, or of having a savior complex. These attributions serve a crucial purpose. They allow the recipient to preserve their self-image. By demonizing the helper, they don't have to confront their own vulnerability or dependence. To the empath, this can feel like emotional whiplash. One moment they're offering heartfelt care. The next, they're met with accusations or called withdrawal. But what's really happening isn't about the empath at all. It's about the other person's inability to face themselves. Jung made it clear that this wasn't a conscious process. Most people don't realize they're projecting. They genuinely believe their negative perception of the empath is accurate. That's what makes this dynamic so painful and confusing. For those offering care, they're not being rejected for something they did, but for something they revealed. Understanding this mirroring dynamic doesn't make it easier emotionally, but it does help empaths detach from the false belief that they are to blame. Jung's work gives them the language and clarity to realize that often the hostility they receive isn't personal, it's psychological. Building on this understanding, Jung explored an even deeper layer of this psychological dynamic, the illusion of superiority embedded in helping relationships. He noted that even when an empath has no desire to control or dominate, the simple act of offering help can unintentionally create a perceived hierarchy. The helper appears in the eyes of the recipient to occupy a position of power, someone who has what they lack, someone who's capable while they're struggling. Jung referred to this reaction as the unconscious hierarchy effect. This occurs when the recipient instinctively assigns roles of superiority and inferiority to the interaction. Even if the empath's gesture is born from humility, the person being helped might subconsciously interpret it as an assertion of dominance. The result is a kind of psychological recoil, an effort to restore balance by rejecting the help or worse, attacking the helper. This defense can manifest in several predictable ways. One is what Jung termed pride armor. The recipient's ego deploys defensive strategies to avoid the emotional blow of feeling inadequate. Accepting help, especially emotional support, can unconsciously feel like regression, almost like reverting to a childlike state of dependency. For many, especially those raised in environments where needing support was equated with weakness, this is unbearable. To protect their pride, they may lash out at the helper's intentions, criticize their methods, or accuse them of interfering even when the help was requested. Another reaction is the competence threat response. Here the recipient begins to question their own abilities simply because someone else saw their need and addressed it. If an empath can recognize their pain or solve a problem they couldn't, it unintentionally shines a light on their perceived inadequacy. This stirs feelings of resentment, not because the help wasn't useful, but because it highlighted the fact that they weren't able to handle things alone. In order to preserve their self-concept, they may discredit or distance themselves from the empath. Perhaps the most ironic and painful response is the autonomy violation perception. In this case, the recipient perceives help as an infringement on their independence. Even when support is offered gently or with permission, it may still be interpreted as a judgment. You're not capable. Rather than seeing it as a gesture of care, they read it as a message of condescension or pity. For people conditioned to value self-sufficiency above all this can trigger defensive anger. They may reject the helper not because of any wrongdoing, but because the interaction itself feels like an assault on their identity. Jung stressed that these reactions occur mostly outside of conscious awareness. They are instinctive psychological maneuvers designed to protect the ego from discomfort. And yet they can destroy relationships that were built on genuine care and mutual respect. Empaths unaware of this dynamic are often left in emotional confusion. What did I do wrong, they ask themselves. Why did my kindness lead to hostility? Jung's answer was simple, yet profound. It's not about what you did, it's about what your help revealed. To further illuminate this dynamic, Jung identified 4 distinct psychological profiles, patterns he saw repeatedly in those who respond to empathic help with hostility. Each of these represents a unique way the psyche attempts to protect itself from vulnerability and the discomfort of receiving care. The first is the pride warrior. These individuals see themselves as fiercely independent, often basing their self-worth on their ability to manage life alone. Any gesture of support, no matter how well-intentioned, is interpreted as a direct threat to their self-image. Jung observed that pride warriors tend to exaggerate their independence in response to perceived threats. When helped, they may respond with theatrical displays of self-reliance, what he called competence theater, designed to prove they're not weak. Empaths are often accused of having ulterior motives, such as needing to feel important or wanting to assert control. But what's really happening is projection. The recipient is transferring their inner discomfort about needing help onto the helper. Second is the shame transformer. These individuals are trapped in a cycle of self-criticism. Deep down, they feel ashamed of needing support. But instead of processing that shame internally, they unconsciously convert it into external blame. In Jungian terms, this is a defense mechanism that allows them to avoid sitting with their own emotional pain. So when an empath offers care, the shame transformer may accuse them of being patronizing or manipulative. It's not the helper they resent, it's the mirror the helper holds up. That mirror reflects their perceived failure, and rather than own those feelings, they redirect them outward. Next is the guilt reactor. These are individuals who respond to help not with relief, but with guilt. They carry a deep belief that their needs are a burden to others, often shaped by early life experiences such as caregivers who helped but also resented it. Guilt reactors internalize the idea that needing support causes harm. When someone like an empath offers pure, non-transactional help, it creates a kind of emotional short circuit. The guilt becomes unbearable, and they may lash out, withdraw, or even reject the empath entirely. Not to protect the empath, but to protect themselves from feeling like a burden. Finally, there's the control detector. These individuals are hypersensitive to any perceived attempts at manipulation. Often shaped by histories of being controlled or coerced, they associate help with hidden agendas. When an empath offers care, they may suspect that strings are attached, even when there are none. This triggers what Jung called freedom defense protocols, a psychological shield that activates whenever autonomy feels threatened. The control detector may reject the helper, not because they dislike them, but because receiving help feels like surrendering power. These 4 patterns, the pride warrior shame transformer, guilt reactor, and control detector, are not flaws in character, but responses to unhealed wounds. And they explain why empaths, no matter how pure their intentions, so often find themselves misunderstood or pushed away. By understanding these patterns, empaths can begin to recognize that rejection isn't always a reflection of their actions. Often, it's a reaction to the psychological material they unknowingly awaken in others. Jung didn't stop at identifying the psychological defense patterns of those who reject empathic help. He also explored the hidden costs empaths bear as a result of these interactions. Offering care is rarely just about the act itself. It's about emotional investment, vulnerability, and a deep-rooted desire to connect. When that effort is met with hostility, the empath doesn't just feel confused. They begin to question the very core of who they are. Jung called this emotional fallout the empathic confusion crisis. When someone with a naturally caring disposition is met with anger or blame for trying to help, it shatters their internal compass. Their intentions were sincere. Their behavior was respectful. Yet the response they receive is accusatory, cold, or outright hostile. This discrepancy leads empaths to question their motivations. Was I being manipulative? Did I cross a line? Was I trying to feel superior without realizing it? Jung noted that this form of confusion is especially dangerous because it attacks the empath's self-trust. It plants seeds of doubt in their ability to read social cues, undermining their confidence in future relationships. Some empaths, after repeated experiences of rejection, develop what Jung termed assistance phobia, a fear of offering help even when it's desperately needed, because they've come to expect emotional backlash. This leads to a second phenomenon Jung identified: the projection poisoning effect. Empaths are naturally receptive individuals. They tune in deeply to others' emotional states. But this very gift makes them vulnerable to absorbing the psychological projections of others. When someone projects shame, guilt, or resentment onto them, the empath may internalize it, even when it's completely inaccurate. For example, if an empath is repeatedly told they are controlling or overbearing, they might start believing that label. Not because it reflects reality, but because they've absorbed someone else's shadow material. Over time, this contamination can erode their self-image, making them overly cautious, self-critical, or emotionally withdrawn. Jung warned that if empaths don't learn to discriminate between projection and truth, they risk losing their natural instincts. They become hyper-vigilant, constantly second-guessing their actions and afraid to show up authentically. In extreme cases, this leads to a suppression of their core identity: caring, compassionate, emotionally intuitive. The third consequence Jung identified is what he termed the relationship destruction pattern. When empathic help is met with hostility, the bond between helper and recipient begins to fray. The empath feels wounded and starts to withdraw, either to protect themselves or out of pride. Meanwhile, the recipient may feel guilty for their reaction, but lack the psychological tools to explain or process it. This creates a cycle of mutual avoidance. Both parties walk on emotional eggshells, unsure how to reconnect without triggering further discomfort. What could have been a healing relationship slowly turns into a distant one, marked by silence, misinterpretation, and unresolved tension. Understanding these consequences isn't meant to discourage empaths from offering help. Instead, Jung's message is one of empowerment through awareness. When empaths understand the unconscious dynamics at play, they can begin to protect their well-being without shutting down their gift of care and connection. To navigate this emotional minefield without becoming hardened or detached, Jung proposed a set of practical strategies and psychological frameworks for both empaths and those they support. His goal wasn't to eliminate the tension between help and rejection, but to transform it into growth, both personal and relational. One of Jung's key solutions was something he called projection recognition training. This practice involves helping recipients of care become aware of when their emotional reactions are more about their own inner wounds than the actions of the empath. Jung encouraged people to look inward when they felt irritated or uncomfortable in response to someone's help. Was the reaction proportional to the situation? Or was it exaggerated, an echo of something older and deeper? Jung developed exercises to promote what he called projection awareness. These included journaling emotional triggers, tracing them back to childhood experiences where receiving help was associated with shame, control, or criticism. He also emphasized the need to distinguish between real boundary violations and mere discomfort with vulnerability. This self-inquiry allowed recipients to pause before lashing out at someone who might be acting with pure intentions. But projection awareness wasn't just for recipients. It was equally crucial for empaths. Jung taught empaths to build projection immunity, the ability to separate someone else's emotional material from their own self-perception. If a person accuses them of being manipulative or condescending, empaths must learn to evaluate whether the accusation is rooted in fact or in that person's unresolved psychological wounds. This is where Jung introduced the concept of empathic boundaries. Just because you feel someone else's pain doesn't mean you are responsible for it. Empathic boundaries don't mean withdrawing your care, they mean staying grounded in your own reality while remaining open to others. It's the difference between being present with someone's suffering versus absorbing it as your own. Jung also designed conscious helping protocols to guide how empaths should offer assistance in ways that minimize defensive reactions. These protocols centered around dignity preservation. The idea that help should be offered in a way that empowers the recipient, not makes them feel lesser. Some of these principles include asking permission before offering advice or support, framing the help as a collaborative process, not a rescue mission, acknowledging the recipient's strengths and existing efforts, respecting their right to decline help without taking offense. This approach shifts the dynamic from, "I'm helping you because you need me to," "I'm here with you because we all need each other sometimes." It removes the subtle implication of superiority and creates emotional safety. On the flip side, Jung encouraged recipients to begin the hard but liberating work of shadow integration. This involves recognizing that needing help is not a failure, but a part of being human. By embracing their own dependency and emotional needs, recipients become less likely to project shame or hostility onto those who support them. They can receive care without feeling threatened or diminished. Jung emphasized that when both parties, empaths and recipients, commit to self-awareness and mutual respect, the destructive cycle of helper rejection can be broken. The relationship becomes a space of healing, not projection. To illustrate these dynamics in action, Jung turned to real-life examples, success stories, and cautionary tales that demonstrate how empathic relationships can either heal or unravel, depending on the psychological awareness of those involved. One of the most powerful success stories is found in the life and work of Fred Rogers, the beloved creator of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Jung would likely have referred to Rogers as a model of non-threatening empathy. What made Rogers so effective wasn't just his emotional intelligence, it was his refusal to position himself as superior. Instead, he offered support while simultaneously affirming the worth and dignity of those he helped, especially children. Rogers didn't try to fix or rescue. He simply acknowledged emotional experiences, held space for vulnerability, and allowed others to feel seen without judgment. This, Jung believed, was the essence of sustainable empathy, respect without hierarchy. It's why Rogers rarely triggered defensive responses. His presence reflected care without implying criticism. Another success story comes from Mother Teresa, whose work embodied what Jung called servant empathy. Though some criticized her methods, Mother Teresa's consistent message was clear: she was not above those she helped. She lived among the poor, embraced humility, and treated every individual as inherently worthy. Her empathy came not from a pedestal, but from proximity. Jung highlighted that when empathy is grounded in humility and a shared sense of humanity, it tends to avoid activating shadow defenses. People don't feel shamed or diminished because the helper doesn't appear above them. Instead, the relationship becomes one of solidarity rather than charity. However, Jung also warned of the opposite end of the spectrum, the codependent trap. This is where empathy is no longer clean or clear, but becomes entangled with unconscious needs to control, be needed, or receive validation. Helpers in this category may offer assistance, but it comes with invisible strings, expectations of gratitude, behavioral change, or emotional loyalty. Codependent empaths often trigger strong rejection because recipients instinctively sense the emotional manipulation, even if it's subtle. The helper may say, "I just want to support you," but their energy communicates, "I need you to validate me in return." This contradiction creates tension. Recipients feel trapped, unable to accept the help without taking on an emotional debt they never agreed to. Jung noted that codependent patterns are common among empaths who haven't examined their own shadow. Their need to help is genuine, but it's fueled by unresolved wounds. Perhaps a need to feel valued, avoid abandonment, or maintain control in chaotic environments. Until these inner drivers are made conscious, their empathy remains entangled with their identity. Culture also plays a role. Jung observed that individualistic societies, particularly in the West, tend to produce higher rates of helper rejection. In these cultures, receiving help is often associated with weakness or failure. Meanwhile, in more interdependent cultures, mutual aid is normalized and not seen as a threat to personal autonomy. Understanding this cultural context allows empaths to adjust their approach depending on their environment and to recognize that not all rejection is personal. Sometimes it's cultural conditioning at work. Jung believed that to truly transform the wounded dynamics between empaths and those they help change must happen not only at the individual level, but also within communities and cultures. His vision extended beyond personal healing. He imagined a society where care and connection weren't obstacles to pride, but expressions of shared humanity. To that end, Jung proposed the concept of helper-safe communities. These are environments intentionally designed to allow empathy to flow freely without triggering defense mechanisms or creating power imbalances. Building such communities, according to Jung, requires three critical components: psychological education, mutual support structures, and dignity-preserving systems. The first pillar, community psychological education, involves raising awareness about the unconscious dynamics that make receiving help so psychologically loaded. People need to learn about projection shadow material and how rejection of care often stems not from the helper's actions, but from internalized shame or unexamined pride. When individuals understand these patterns, they can pause before reacting defensively, ask better questions, and engage in more honest self-reflection. Jung emphasized that emotional maturity begins with recognizing the difference between a boundary and a wound. A boundary is rooted in clarity and self-respect. A wound lashes out to protect itself. Teaching people how to distinguish between these two empowers them to respond to empathy without fear or suspicion. Second, Jung advocated for reciprocal empathy system structures within communities that support both giving and receiving. In such systems, everyone plays both roles at different times. People are not labeled permanently as helpers or receivers. Instead, empathy becomes a shared resource exchanged as needed. This helps dismantle the hidden hierarchy that often poisons helper-recipient dynamics. These mutual support systems also reinforce the idea that it's normal to need help sometimes, and just as normal to offer it. Jung argued that such structures would reduce the psychological burden of pride and decrease the likelihood of projection-based conflict. Third, and perhaps most practically, Jung proposed dignity-preserving assistance systems. These are protocols and practices that ensure help is offered in a way that respects autonomy and does not diminish the recipient's self-worth. This might include offering help instead of insisting, validating the recipient's ability to decide what kind of support they need, allowing space for no without taking offense, emphasizing collaboration rather than control. Jung recognized that sometimes the most caring act is to not intervene, but to trust in another's ability to navigate their own challenges. In this way, dignity is preserved even when help is offered. These ideas weren't abstract ideals to Jung, they were essential to preventing what he called the empathy erosion crisis, a societal shift where people stop offering care because they've learned that care often leads to conflict. If enough empaths are burned by rejection, they begin to suppress their natural instincts. Over time, this leads to isolation, emotional disconnection, and cultural fragmentation. To preserve empathy in its healthiest form, both individuals and communities must understand and integrate the unconscious dynamics at play. When this happens, empathy becomes sustainable, not something to fear, but something to celebrate. Ultimately, Jung believed that understanding why empaths are sometimes met with hate is not about avoiding pain, it's about transcending confusion. When we recognize that defensive hostility often arises from unhealed parts of the self, not from the helper's actions, we free ourselves from taking rejection personally. For empaths, this awareness brings emotional resilience. For recipients, it opens the door to healing. And for everyone, it paves the way to relationships grounded in authenticity, respect, and mutual care. If this resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more insights into human psychology.